Hello my good friends, welcome back to another Study With Me video. Today we're looking again at Cassar Sunstein's book How Change Happens, in particular Chapter 3, The Expressive Function of Law. Actions are expressive. They carry meanings. This is true for nearly everything we do, from the most mundane to the most significant. A lawyer who wears a loud tie to court signals something distinctive about his self-conception and his attitude toward others. So too a professor who teaches in blue jeans, so too a student who comes to class in a business suit. What can be said for non-verbal acts applies to purely verbal statements as well. A bank president who uses the terms Miss and Mrs., or who refers to African Americans as Negroes, shows a wide range of things about his attitudes on matters of gender and race. In these and other cases, what the agent communicates or will be taken to mean may or may not have a great deal to do with his intentions. In this sense, the meanings of his actions are not fully within the agent's control. Indeed, some agents may not even be aware of the relevant meanings. Consider a foreigner whose very foreignness is often signaled by obliviousness to the social meanings of his actions. What he says may be very different from what he means. The social meanings of actions are very much a function of existing social norms. When a social norm tells people not to smoke in public places, the social meaning of smoking is obtuseness, discourtesy, or worse. When a social norm requires people to dress casually for dinner, formal attire means something bad, like a desire to seem superior or a manifestation of an odd social rigidity. And when social norms change, social meaning changes too. Thus, the social meanings of lighting up a cigarette, engaging in an act of sexual harassment, using a condom, or refusing to eat meat are very different now from what they were in 1961 because of dramatic shifts in underlying norms. What can be said for actions can also be said for law. Many people support law because of the statements made by law, and disagreements about law are frequently debates over the expressive content of law rather than its consequences. Much of the debate over school segregation, for example, was about the meaning of laws calling for segregation. Plessy v. Ferguson asserted that such laws did not mean black inferiority. Brown v. Board of Education tried to respond to this assertion with empirical work suggesting the contrary. So too, debates over immigration may not be mostly about economic growth and employment. They have a large expressive dimension. Those who seek to reduce immigration want to make a statement. It is our country, not theirs. Those who seek to increase immigration want to make a statement. We are open to outsiders. Of course, both sides also care about consequences, but the expressive content of immigration policy looms very large. In the 1980s, the enormously lengthy and heated debate over whether flag burning is protected by the Constitution was permeated by expressive concerns. By seeking to outlaw flag burning, people wanted to make a statement about patriotism and love of country. If we ask whether the debate is about how best to deter flag burning, we will find the debate unintelligible. In the 1980s, the number of people who burned the American flag was not exactly high, and it is reasonable to suppose that a constitutional amendment making it possible to criminalize flag burning would have among its principal consequences a dramatic increase in actual acts of flag burning. In fact, adopting a constitutional amendment may be the best possible way to promote the incidence of flag burning. People might burn the flag to show that they abhor the amendment. In these circumstances, it seems clear that those who supported the amendment were motivated not so much by consequences as by expressive concerns. They wanted to make a statement about the venality of the act of flag burning, perhaps to affect social norms, perhaps because they thought that making the statement is intrinsically good. For a more recent example, consider President Donald Trump's efforts to encourage the National Football League to punish its players for refusing to kneel during the national anthem. To be sure, Trump did not argue that the refusal to kneel should be a crime, but he did want the players to be punished. The debate over his efforts was intensely expressive. Did the refusal to kneel show a disrespect for one's country, or was it an acceptable way of protesting injustice? In many nations, the debate over regulating hate speech is similar. It is above all the social meaning of such regulation. Do bans on hate speech mean that victims of hate speech require special paternalistic protections, are weak and thin-skinned, and are unable to take care of themselves? Or do they mean that bigotry is utterly unacceptable in a liberal society? Debates of this kind could not plausibly be focused on consequences, for the stakes are usually low. We're not dealing with action after all, and thus cannot justify the amount of time and energy devoted to the issue. In this way, debates over flag burning and debates over hate speech have a great deal in common. They are expressive in character. Consider too a subject far afield from constitutional law, but bearing directly on the role of law in a democracy: risk regulation. In environmental protection, public debate often is focused on the perceived social meaning of law. Thus, the Endangered Species Act has a special salience as a symbol of a certain conception of the relationship between human beings and their environment. Efforts to weaken the Endangered Species Act may or may not have large consequences for endangered species, but people who oppose such efforts are insisting on certain values. In the same way, mandatory recycling, as opposed to curbside charges, which seem far better from an economic standpoint, may well receive public support on expressive grounds. In the legal profession, the same may also be true of mandatory pro bono work, as opposed to compulsory donations from lawyers who refuse to do such work. In this chapter, I explored the expressive function of law, the function of law in making statements as opposed to controlling behaviour directly. Statements can be seen as nudges, at least if they are unaccompanied by sanctions, see Part 2. I focus on the particular issue of how legal statements might be designed to change social norms. I catalogue a range of possible and, in my view, legitimate efforts to alter norms through legal expressions about appropriate, evaluative attitudes. I also argued that the expressive function of law makes most sense in connection with efforts to change norms, and that if legal statements produce bad consequences, they should not be enacted even if they seem reasonable or noble. Making statements. We might understand the expressive function of law in two different ways. First, and most straightforwardly, the law's statement about, for example, the risks of distracted driving may be designed to affect social norms and, in that way, ultimately to affect both judgments and behaviour. The goal is to reduce distracted driving and thus to save lives. On this view, an expressive approach to law depends on an assessment of social consequences. Certain expressions are favoured because they will ultimately have good consequences. Here there is a prediction about the facts. An appropriately framed law may influence social norms and push them in the right direction. If the law mandates recycling, perhaps it will affect social norms about the environment in a desirable way. Or people might think that if the law treats something, say sexual capacities, as a commodity for sale and exchange, social norms may be affected in a troublesome way. People might start to see such capacities in a way that will demean and disparage them. The legitimation of prostitution might spill over into ordinary relationships in a destructive way. Sometimes the claim that the law affects norms is plausible. Prevailing norms, like preferences and beliefs, are usually not a pre-social given, but a product of a complex set of social forces, sometimes including law. Laws designed to change norms will be my focus here. But sometimes people support a law not because of its effects on norms, but because they believe that it is intrinsically valuable for the relevant statement to be made. And sometimes law will have little or no effect on social norms. Thus, a second understanding of the expressive function of law does not concern itself with effects on norms at all. Instead, its grounding is connected with the individual interest in integrity. In a brief but suggestive discussion, Bernard Williams notes that people often refuse to perform offensive or objectionable actions even though their refusal will result in worse consequences. Williams argues that our actions are determined not only by consequences, but by judgments related to personal integrity, commitment, the narrative continuity of a life, and the individual and social meaning of personal conduct. The expressive dimension of action can be an important reason for action. Williams offers cases that might be understood in these terms. Someone might refuse to kill an innocent person at the request of a terrorist, even if the consequence of their refusal is that many more people will be killed. Or a pacifist might refuse to take a job in a munitions factory, even if the refusal has no real effect on the factory itself. People's responses to these cases are not adequately captured in terms that ignore expressive considerations, and Williams thinks that people's responses are right. To be sure, it is possible that the refusal to kill an innocent person is consequentially justified on balance, for people who refuse to commit bad acts may cultivate attitudes that lead to value-maximizing behaviour. But this is a complex matter, and it is not Williams' point, nor is it the view of those who defend law for expressive reasons. In my view, Williams' argument is not convincing. He is using a moral heuristic for what counts, which is welfare. See chapters 14 and 15 for details. My point here is only that human behaviour is sometimes a function of expressive considerations. We might agree on this point, even if we also believe that consequences count and that people should not be fanatical. There is an analogue at the social and legal level. A society might identify the norms to which it is committed and insist on those norms via a law, even if the consequences of the insistence are obscure or unknown. A society might insist on a constitutional right against racial discrimination or a civil rights law for expressive reasons, even if it is unsure to what extent the right or the law will actually help members of minority groups. A society might endorse or reject capital punishment because it wants to express a certain understanding of the appropriate course of action when one person takes the life of another. A society might protect animal welfare for the same reason. The point bears on the cultural role of law, adjudication, and even Supreme Court decisions. The empirical effects of those decisions are highly disputed. If the Supreme Court holds that the segregation is unlawful, that certain restrictions on hate speech violate the First Amendment, or that students cannot be asked to pray in school, the real-world consequences may be smaller than is conventionally thought. But the close attention American society pays to the court's pronouncements is connected with the expressive or symbolic character of those pronouncements. When the court makes a decision, it is often taken to be speaking on behalf of the nation's basic principles and commitments. The idea that the court's decisions have an expressive function captures what is often at stake. I do not claim that the expressive effects of law, thus understood, are decisive or that they cannot be countered by a demonstration of more conventional bad consequences. In fact, I will argue otherwise and thus try to vindicate Simon's remark in the epigraph to this book. Recall his words. Sometimes we just want to scream loudly at injustice or to stand up and be counted. These are noble motives, but any serious revolutionist must often deprive himself of the pleasures of self-expression. He must judge his actions by their ultimate effects on institutions. My principal aim is to defend laws that attempt to alter norms rather than laws that merely speak. It cannot be doubted, however, that the expressive function is a large part of legal debate. Without understanding the expressive function of law, we'll have a hard time getting an adequate handle on public views on such issues as civil rights, free speech, welfare rights, prostitution, the environment, immigration, endangered species, capital punishment, and abortion. Collective action problems. Many social norms solve collective action problems. Some of these problems involve coordination. Others involve prisoners' dilemmas. Norms solve such problems by imposing social sanctions on defectors. When defection violates norms, defectors might well feel guilt or shame, important motivational forces. The community may enforce its norms through informal punishment, the most extreme form of which is ostracism. But the most effective use of norms happens before an act is even committed. The expectation of guilt or shame, a kind of social tax, sometimes a very high one, is usually enough to produce compliance. Thus, for example, if there is a norm in favour of cooperation, people may be able to interact with one another in a way that is in their mutual interest. Professors write tenure letters and engage in a wide range of tedious administrative tasks that they could refuse to do at little cost. putting to one side guilt or shame, the emotional price of violating institutional norms. Or suppose that a community is pervaded by a strong norm against littering. If the norm is truly pervasive, a problem of environmental degradation can be solved without any need for legal intervention. The norm can do what the law would do at much greater cost. The norms associated with courtesy and considerateness are an especially important source of successful interaction among strangers and friends and within families. Sometimes, however, good norms do not exist and bad ones exist in their stead, where we understand good or bad by reference to the functions of norms in solving collective action problems. Imagine, for example, there is no norm in favour of refusing to litter, or even that there is a norm in favour of littering. In the face of such norms, the social meaning of littering may be independence and fearlessness, and the social meaning of cleaning up or failing to litter may be fastidiousness or even cowardness or neurosis. In such a situation, a society would, under imaginable assumptions, do well to reconsider and reconstruct its norms. It may be able to do so through voluntary efforts. We have seen that norm entrepreneurs in the private sphere attempt to change norms by identifying their bad consequences and trying to shift the bases of guilt, shame, and pride. Many norm entrepreneurs are alert to the existence of collective action problems. In the environmental setting, public interest groups often carry out this role by pressing private conduct in environmentally desirable directions, sometimes by providing new grounds for both pride, a kind of informal social subsidy, and guilt or shame, a kind of informal social tax. But sometimes these private efforts fail. When this is so, the law might be enlisted as a corrective. In fact, the least controversial use of the expressive function of law operates in this way, as an attempted solution to some kind of collective action problem. Here the goal is to reconstruct existing norms and to change the social meaning of action through a legal expression or statement about appropriate behaviour. Insofar as regulatory law is concerned with collective action problems, this is a standard idea, especially in the environmental context, but also in the settings of automobile safety, occupational safety and health, and many other problems. What is perhaps less standard is to see the law as an effort to produce adequate social norms. The law might either do the work of such norms or instead be designed to work directly against existing norms and to push them in new directions. The latter idea is grounded in the view that law will have moral weight and thus convince people that existing norms are bad and deserve to be replaced by new ones. Sometimes legal mandates take the place of good norms by requiring certain forms of behaviour through statutory requirements accompanied by significant enforcement activity. Environmental law, for example, imposes legal mandates to control industrial pollution. It adds a large commitment of enforcement resources. But there is a subtler and more interesting class of cases of special importance for understanding the expressive function of law. These cases arise when the relevant law announces or signals a change in social norms unaccompanied by much in the way of enforcement activity. Consider, for example, laws that forbid smoking in public places, laws that forbid littering, and laws that require people to clean up after their dogs. In many localities, such laws are rarely enforced through criminal law, but they have an important effect in signalling appropriate behaviour and in inculcating the expectation of social opprobrium and hence guilt or shame in those who deviate from the announced norm. With or without enforcement activity, such laws can help reconstruct norms and the social meaning of action. Someone who fails to clean up after his dog may then be showing disrespect or even contempt for others. Many, most, or all people may see things this way, and large changes in behaviour can result. Eventually, there can be norm cascades as reputational incentives shift behaviour in new directions. It should be unsurprising to find that in many places, people clean up after their dogs even though doing so is not especially pleasant and even though the laws are rarely enforced. When legally induced shifts in norms help solve collective action problems, there should be no objection in principle. Here then is the least controversial case for the expressive function of law. Danger. Often the expressive function of law is brought to bear on dangerous behaviour, including behaviour that is dangerous only or principally to oneself. Of course, all behaviour creates risks. Driving a car, walking on city streets, volunteering for military service. When government tries to change norms that subsidise risk-taking behaviour, it must do so because of a judgment that the change will promote overall welfare. This judgment might be rooted in an understanding that the intrinsic utility of the act is relatively low and that reputational incentives are the real source of the behaviour. We are dealing then with cases in which risk-taking behaviour persists because of social norms. There are numerous examples. Elijah Anderson's vivid sociological analysis of life in an African American ghetto shows how social norms can create a variety of risks. Powerful norms motivate people to use and sell drugs. Powerful norms motivate teenagers to engage in sexual activity that may result in pregnancy. Anderson shows that with respect to drugs, pregnancy, and the use of firearms, behaviour is driven in large part by reputational effects. For much risk-taking behaviour, especially among young people, social norms are the crucial factor. Consider, for example, the existence of powerful norms governing cigarette smoking, alcohol use, the consumption of unlawful drugs, diet and exercise, texting while driving, and carrying and using firearms. It is easy to imagine the decision to smoke a cigarette or not to buckle a seatbelt would be a function not primarily of the intrinsic utility of the underlying act, but instead largely of the reputational effects. Norm entrepreneurs in the private sector can play an important role here. Thus, for example, there was a dramatic decrease in cigarette smoking among young African Americans in the early 1990s, a decrease apparently fueled by changes in social norms for which private norm entrepreneurs are partly responsible. In the relevant communities, the changes meant that the social meaning of smoking was not attractiveness, independence, and rebelliousness, but dirtiness and willingness to be duped. More broadly, religious leaders often try to change social norms involving risky conduct such as promiscuous behaviour. But here, as elsewhere, private efforts may be unsuccessful. In this light, law might attempt to express a judgment about the underlying activity in such a way as to alter social norms. If we see norms as a tax on or subsidy to choice, the law might attempt to change a subsidy into a tax or vice versa. In fact, this is a central, even if implicit, goal behind much risk regulation policy. Educational campaigns often have the goal of changing the social meaning of risk-taking activity. Going beyond the provision of information and nudging, coercion might be defended as a way of increasing social sanctions on certain behaviour. Through time, place, and manner restrictions or flat bans, for example, the law might attempt to portray behaviour like smoking, using drugs, or engaging in unsafe sex as a sign of stupidity or weakness. Are such efforts illiberal or unacceptably paternalistic? Under imaginable assumptions, they should not be so regarded. Choices are a function of norms for which individual agents are not responsible and which, on reflection, many or most agents may not endorse. This is conspicuously so in the context of risk-taking activity involving cigarettes, drugs, unsafe sex, and firearms. Much discussion of whether laws should respect preferences or choices is confused by virtue of its silence on the matter of social norms. People may follow such norms despite the fact that they deplore them. It is important in this regard that social norms are often a function of existing information. If people start to believe that smoking is dangerous to themselves and to others, it becomes more likely that social norms will discourage smoking. Certainly, there has been a dramatic norm cascade in the last 50 years with respect to smoking, a cascade fueled in large part by judgments about adverse health effects. Shifts in norms governing behaviour may well be produced by new information about risk, although norms can shift in both directions. Sometimes a perception of dangerousness increases the attractiveness of behaviour. One can imagine similar information-induced norm cascades with respect to diet, sugar consumption, exercise, and unsafe sex. In fact, people often try to bring norms into accord with existing information. Because the provision of information, a kind of nudge, is the least intrusive regulatory strategy, it should be the preferred option. Other nudges may also help. Whether more aggressive strategies make sense depends on their costs and benefits. See Part 2. Money. A complex network of social norms governs the acceptable uses of money. This is so in two different respects. First, some social norms impose sanctions on using money as a reason for action. Here, people are not supposed to engage in certain acts if their reason for doing so is financial gain. Second, some social norms make different kinds of money non-fungible. That is, the prevailing norms require different kinds of money to be used for different purposes. These sets of norms raise many complexities. They are also entangled with the expressive function of law. Finally, they suggest that it is sometimes inappropriate to infer general valuations from particular choices because those choices are a function of norms that are limited to the context in which they are made. Let us begin with norms punishing the use of money as a reason for action. An instructive article by Joel Waldfogel, The Deadweight Loss of Christmas, will help to introduce the point. Waldfogel finds no less than $4 million in annual deadweight losses from the fact that people give in-kind presents rather than mere cash on Christmas Day. Waldfogel's analysis is simple. For those who give presents, the cost of Christmas is higher than it would be if they gave cash instead. The cost of gift giving includes not just the expenditure of money, but also the time and effort devoted to deciding what gifts to give. And for those who receive presents, the benefit is typically lower than it would be if they received cash. Many people don't like what they get, and even if they do like it, they don't like it a lot. Recipients would be better off if they received cash, which they could use as they wished, just as food stamps are worth less than their dollar value because, unlike cash, they can only be spent on food. The $4 million waste is a result of these sorts of considerations. Waldfogel's findings are intriguing, but he neglects the role of social norms. In many contexts, norms severely discourage the giving of cash rather than, say, a tie, a book, or a sweater. Under existing norms, a cash present from a husband to a wife or a father to a son, for example, may reflect contempt or indifference. It might even seem to be a joke. This is precisely because cash is both impersonable and fungible. A tie or a book, whether or not it is a wonderful tie or a wonderful book, fits well with norms that call for a degree of individualized attention on the part of the donor. Waldfogel devotes too little attention to the cluster of Christmas-related norms and the social meaning of diverse forms of gift-giving. What can be said for Christmas can be said for many areas of social life in which money is deemed an inappropriate basis for action. If someone asks an adult neighbour to shovel his walk or to mow his lawn in return for money, the request will often be regarded as an insult because it is based on an inappropriate valuation of the neighbour. The request embodies a conception of neighbourliness that is, under existing norms, judged improper. A neighbour is not a servant. The norm is in place even if the offeree would in some sense be better off if he received the money in return for undertaking the task. Quite generally, it is inappropriate to offer money to one's friends in return for hurt feelings, disappointments, tasks, or favours. If you have been unkind, offering a friend an apology is a good idea. Offering a cheque is not. In fact, the universe of cases in which norms disallow monetary exchange is very large and unremarked upon only because it is so taken for granted. It would be quite strange to give an adult a certain sum of money after hearing that his parent had died, or to ask a colleague to clean up your office for, say, $250. This is so even though favours are of course common, and even though there can be in-kind implicit transactions between friends, neighbours, and even spouses. There is often a connection between norms that block exchanges and ideas about equal citizenship. The exchange can be barred by social norms because of a perception that, though there may be disparities in social wealth, the spheres in which people are very unequal ought not to invade realms of social life in which equality is a social norm or goal. The prohibition on vote trading is one example. So too with certain social taboos on the use of wealth to buy services or goods, for example organ donation, from other people. I do not mean to resolve the question whether such taboos are a good idea. Some part of the intricate web of norms covering the exchange of money among both friends and strangers is connected with the principles of civic equality. Monetary exchange would reflect forms of inequality that are not legitimate in certain spheres. Familiar objections to commodification are part and parcel of social norms banning the use of money. The claim is that people ought not to trade sexuality or reproductive capacities on markets because market exchange of these things is inconsistent with social norms identifying their appropriate valuation. The claim is not that markets value sexuality too much or too little, rather it is that markets value these activities in the wrong way. Under existing practice, social norms of course affect the adoption of children and impose severe sanctions on any effort, literally, to sell children even to willing and loving parents. The fact that the adoption market is accompanied by safeguards making any sale, at most implicit, is meant to reaffirm existing norms. This point very much bears on law. In many ways, law tries to fortify norms regulating the use of money and to prevent new social practices from eroding these norms. This is an important domain for the expressive use of law. It is connected with the effort to create separate social spheres, some in which money is appropriately a basis for action, some in which money cannot be used. Thus, the law bans a wide range of uses of money. Votes cannot be traded for cash. The same is true of body parts. In many places, prostitution is illegal. There is a sharp social debate about surrogate motherhood, and those who seek legal prescriptions are thinking in expressive terms. One of their goals may be to fortify existing social norms that insulate reproduction from the sphere of exchange, or their argument may be less instrumental. They may seek to make a statement about reproduction without also seeking to affect social norms. Equality. Norms of partiality are an important part of social inequality. Social norms may require women to perform the most domestic labour. In some places, women who refuse to do so may incur social sanctions and may even feel guilty or ashamed. The social meaning of a woman's refusal may be a rejection of her appropriate gender role, and the refusal may be interpreted by others as a signal of a range of undesirable traits. In the areas of both race and gender, prevailing norms help constitute inequality. And here, as elsewhere, collective action is sometimes necessary to reconstitute existing norms. Private norm entrepreneurs may be able to accomplish a great deal. With respect to the division of domestic labour between men and women, private efforts at norm management have played an important role. Individual acts that are expressive in character, a refusal to clean clothes or to make dinner for example, are an important part of modern feminism. The expressive function of law is especially important here, and it can move to the fore in public debates. If a discriminatory act is consistent with prevailing norms, there will be more in the way of discriminatory behaviour. If discriminators are ashamed of themselves, there is likely to be less discrimination. A large point of law may be to shift social norms and social meaning, see Chapter 1. Recall in this connection that many restaurant owners and innkeepers supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which would have prevented them from discriminating. Why would people want the state to act against them? The answer lies in the fact that the law helped shift social norms and the social meaning of non-discrimination. Would formally signal a willingness to act on a race-neutral basis and hence would trigger social norms that call for discrimination on the basis of race. It would henceforth signal a willingness to obey the law and hence fail to trigger adverse social norms. Social norms help constitute a wide range of qualitatively different kinds of valuation, and these diverse valuations much affect behaviour and the social meaning of behaviour. These norms are omnipresent and are usually taken for granted. Imagine, for example, that Jane values a plant in the same way that most people value their children, or that Sandy values her car like most people value art or literature. Anti-discrimination law is often designed to change norms so as to ensure that people are treated with a kind of dignity and respect that discriminatory behaviour seems to deny. The point is not limited to race and sex equality. Consider, as an especially interesting example, the movement for animal welfare and animal rights. Some people think that animals should be treated with dignity and respect and not as if they exist solely for human consumption, play and use. This view is very much about social norms. It need not entail the further claim that animal life is infinitely valuable. It is best taken as a recommendation for a shift in norms governing the treatment of animals, accompanied by a judgment that the new norms will have good consequences for what human beings do. The recommendation may be based on the view that if we see animals and nature in general in this way, we will solve collective action problems, ecological in nature, faced by human beings. It may be based on a non-instrumental effort to extend ideals of basic dignity to all living things. In its most powerful form, the goal is to ensure that other living creatures are treated with kindness and respect, and not as if they are mere things. The expressive function of law can be important in making that more likely. Qualifications. The discussion thus far has certainly not been exhaustive. There are many areas in which law is used in an expressive way, largely to manage social norms. Criminal law is a prime arena for the expressive function of law. As we've seen, the debate over flag burning has everything to do with the statement that law makes. I hope I've said enough to show the wide range of possible expressions via law and to see how the law might plausibly be used to manage social norms. I now qualify the basic argument. The first set of qualifications stems from a hard question. What if the statement seems right, but the consequences are unfortunate? The second set of qualifications emerges from the need to impose constraints on the expressive function of law. Consequences. I have suggested that some expressivists are concerned with norm management, whereas others are concerned with the statement law makes entirely apart from its consequences. Expressivists can be both fanatical and ineffectual, a most unfortunate combination. For those who endorse the expressive function of law, the most important testing cases arise when A. People support laws because of the statement made by such laws, but B. The effects of such laws seem bad or ambiguous, even by reference to the values held by their supporters. How should such cases be understood? My basic proposition is that any support for statements via law should be rooted in plausible judgments about their effects on social norms and hence in on-balance judgments about their consequences. Here we can bridge the gap between consequentialists and expressivists by showing that good expressivists are consequentialists too. They want to make the world better, not just to say things. If saying things makes the world better, then things should be said. If not, then not. Consider, for example, the debate over emissions trading in environmental law. With such trading, polluters are allowed to buy and sell pollution rights with the goal of reducing pollution to the right degree and at the right cost. Some of the most pervasive objections to emissions trading are expressive in nature. Critics claim that emissions trading has damaging effects on social norms by making environmental amenities seem like any other commodity, a good that has its price to be set through market mechanisms. They contend that emissions trading systems may have damaging effects on social norms by making people see the environment as something unobjectionable and without special claims to public protection. To some extent, the suggestion might be taken as an empirical prediction and evaluated as such. Will emissions trading systems have substantial effects on social norms associated with the environment? On that issue, we may be able to make some progress. We have an empirical question that is subject in principle to empirical resolution. If emissions trading programs could be shown to have bad effects on social norms, they might be rejected notwithstanding their other virtues. Perhaps the overall effects on such programs would be bad. Compare this to the question whether to require recycling. Mandatory recycling might well have better effects on norms than curbside charges. But in the area of emissions trading programs, we should be skeptical about the expressivists' concern. There is no evidence that such programs weaken people's commitment to clean air and water. Public attitudes toward the environment do not depend much on whether government has a command and control system or instead relies on emissions trading or other economic incentives. Some people appear to think that it is intrinsically problematic to say, through law, that environmental amenities are ordinary goods with appropriate prices. Is this a convincing objection to emissions trading programs if, as we might suppose, such programs can save billions of dollars in return for the same degree of environmental protection? It is hard to see the force of the objection if, in fact, costs are lower, jobs are saved, the air is cleaner, norms are held constant, and fewer people are poor. On what basis should the statement made by law be taken to be cause for concern? Or consider the question whether the minimum wage should be significantly increased. A possible justification for such increases is expressive in nature. Many people think that the government ought to make a statement to the effect that human labour is worth, at a minimum, X dollars per hour. Perhaps any amount less than X dollars seems like an assault on human dignity. But suppose too that the consequence of the minimum wage is to increase unemployment among the most vulnerable members of society. Why should we care about mere statements if the overall effects are bad? If a significant increase in the minimum wage would really drive vulnerable people out of the workplace in significant numbers, it is not easy to see why people should support it. I do not mean to take a final stand on the question whether the minimum wage should be significantly increased. That depends on the consequences. The point is that expressive approaches to law verge on fanaticism where effects on norms are unlikely and where the consequences of the statement are bad. Constraints. What barriers should there be to governmental efforts at managing social norms? The simplest answer is simple: the same barriers that apply to any other kind of governmental action. Thus, for example, government should not be permitted to invade rights, whatever our understanding of rights may be. The rights constraints that apply to government action generally are fully applicable here as well. If government tried to change social norms through legislation so as to ensure that women would occupy domestic roles and men would not, it would violate the Equal Protection Clause. If government tried to change social norms through legislation to ensure that everyone would be Protestant, it would violate the right to religious liberty. At least these conclusions would make sense if government action is coercive. Quite apart from the question of rights, there is always a risk that efforts at norm management will be futile or counterproductive. When government attempts to move social norms in a particular direction, it may fail miserably, see Chapter 9. It is necessary to ensure that those who engage in norm management are trusted by the people whose norms are at issue. For this reason, it may be best for government to attempt to enlist the private sector to ensure that people with authority in relevant communities are participating in the process. Some people would go further than this. From one view, any effort at norm management is illegitimate. This is a project that is off limits to government. But it is hard to see how this argument might be made persuasive. Effects on social norms are not easily avoided. Any system of government is likely to affect norms, including through the creation of the basic systems of contract, tort, and property. With respect to prevention of violent crime, intentional norm management is a conventional and time-honoured part of government. To be sure, we could imagine abuses, even unspeakable ones, but the proper response is to insist on a wide range of rights-based constraints on the management of social norms through law. No system of law can avoid that managerial role. Even markets themselves, which are very much a creation of law, are exercises in norm management. In these circumstances, it is best for government to proceed pragmatically and contextually, seeing which norms are obstacles to well-being and using law when it is effective in providing correctives. If you're still with me after that particularly long one, thank you very much. This one was a bit of a mixed bag for me. I think I liked a lot of the analysis at the start, where they were discussing aspects of arguing for different laws based on expressions rather than the actual consequences. Kind of got away from me at the end with some of the matter-of-fact way that they inserted their political narratives in there, which I disagree with, but that's okay. If you got anything out of this or it raised any questions for you, chuck them in the comments below and hopefully we can have a bit of a chat. I'll see you later.